George Rivera was born in the Bronx borough of New York City on January 10, 1968, to parents who came from Puerto Rico. His first childhood home was in a tenement building right here on East Tremont Avenue in the predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood just north of the South Bronx. His father left when he was 6 months old, and afterwards he and his younger brother moved around with their mother to different neighborhoods in the Bronx and lived in the Soundview projects in the Soundview neighborhood of the South Bronx for a time. As George was coming up in the 1970s, the Bronx had gone through a major urban decay, and many areas became impoverished, run down, and riddled with crime and drugs. The South Bronx had also experienced an epidemic of burning buildings, in which entire city blocks were burnt down, displacing hundreds of thousands of residents and leaving the area looking like an abandoned war zone. During that time, the borough also saw a big rise in Latin and Black street gangs, and one gang named the Savage Skulls declared war on drug dealers in the Hunts Point area of the South Bronx. At the same time the Bronx was struggling to pull itself out of socioeconomic despair, the borough birthed the genre of hip-hop music. Rap and DJ battles regularly occurred at venues around the borough, now commonly referred to as the Boogie Down Bronx, and soon Bronx rap artists would be featured on the airwaves. Breakdancing and graffiti writing were also major elements of the Bronx culture. Tags could be found everywhere you looked, and breakdancing crews like the New York City Breakers and the Rocksteady crew gained national attention for their innovative dances. George didn't have any friends as a boy, and he found solace in the cats and dogs that he kept as pets, but witnessed several of them get killed after being run over by cars in front of his building. He only saw his father on sporadic occasions and had a volatile relationship with his mother. His mother was overly possessive of her children and very unpredictable, and would regularly beat George and his brother, sometimes with extreme viciousness using an extension cord. His neighborhood was overrun with drug activity, and while walking to elementary school, George would see dealers on every other corner. When he was 10 years old, he ran away from home for a period of time and wandered around this very area, the Hunts Point neighborhood of the South Bronx. He slept in abandoned cars and on benches right here in St. Mary's Park, and used water from fire hydrants to wash his face and teeth. By the time George was 12 years old, his mother had requested assistance from the city as a parent in need of supervision. He was sent to a treatment center for troubled youth in Pleasantville, New York, where he stayed for 3 months. There, George made the acquaintance of a young Mike Tyson, who was also making his rounds through the juvenile delinquent system. Afterwards, George was sent to live in a group home named St. Cabrini's in New Rochelle, New York, to live with 7 other kids, where he was the youngest boy. Although George was removed from his home, he was relieved to be away from his mother and her rages. The 8 kids all lived in a 2-story home on Brookdale Avenue in New Rochelle and attended the local schools. While in the group home, George lived with members of the 5% Nation, which is a Black culturalist movement, and George learned from them and emulated their ways of life. Coming from impoverished backgrounds, most of the kids had trouble assimilating into their new middle-class environment, but George didn't have the same issue. He was a bright kid and was known in school for his sense of humor and practical jokes, who people took a liking to. George took a nighttime job stocking shelves at a local grocery store, but he was a natural go-getter and had ambitions of getting his hands on whatever he wanted, regardless of its legal classification. He attended New Rochelle High School and played football, being the only Puerto Rican kid on the team, and his pick was published in a local newspaper. George had a charisma and affable personality which transcended his rough upbringing, and he was able to make friends with kids in the neighborhood. He would get invited to parties at the rich kids' houses and would bring his friends from the Cabrini home along with him. Remnants of those poor upbringings still remained in those Cabrini boys, and George and his friends took to criminal activities in their new suburban surroundings. While George and his pals were in attendance at one of those rich kids' parties, they stole silverware from the home. Afterwards, they decided to burglarize other homes in the area, but were apprehended by police. In January of 1984, George and 3 other kids were charged with burglary. George and another accomplice pled guilty to a charge, and he was sentenced to 13 months at a juvenile detention hall in Valhalla in Westchester County, New York. After his release from juvenile detention in 1985, George considered joining the military, but instead he returned to the Bronx to live with his mother. He briefly attended Morris High School in the South Bronx before dropping out and taking to the streets for good. That was when he became acquainted with Joey Navedo, a 30-year-old local cocaine dealer who was known as Joey White. Joey was a brazen character who was feared by many in the neighborhood. He was flashy and drove around town in Porsches and Benzes. He gave out turkeys to local residents on Thanksgiving and toys to kids on Christmas. Navedo did business in New York and Florida, and in 1981, he was arrested at the Miami airport for cocaine possession. George asked Joey for work, and Joey hired him as a lookout for one of his cocaine spots on Cortlandt Avenue and East 156th Street, and not long afterwards, George began dealing coke for him. Joey taught him the trade, and due to George's precocious savvy and smarts at such a young age, Joey gave him the nickname which would be his moniker in the streets and stick with him for the rest of his life, Boy George. At that time, the name Boy George was a name already known to many as being the lead singer of the Culture Club, a group whose music was making waves throughout the world, but another Boy George would soon be making waves throughout the underworld. George idolized Joey and wanted to be like him. The two attended car shows together, went skiing in the Poconos, shot guns at a range in Mount Vernon, and took trips to the Great Adventure amusement park in New Jersey. Joey introduced him to an upscale restaurant in Manhattan named Victor's Cafe, as well as to his jeweler on Canal Street in Chinatown. Joey's preferred way to control his operation in the streets was through fear and intimidation, a managerial method which George had little problem adapting to. Towards the end of 1985, the drug crack began infiltrating the streets of New York City. The smokable derivative of cocaine quickly caught on amongst drug users, due to it being cheaper, more accessible, and providing an instant high. The South Bronx and uptown Manhattan were ravaged by the drug, and neighborhoods which were already full of poverty and crime had dwindled into even more decrepit and deadly urban landscapes. Through Joey, George became acquainted with a kid who had a female relative working in the heroin trade. By 1986, crack was becoming the preferred drug of choice for many inner-city dealers, but heroin was still very much in demand. George soon decided to switch his operation from cocaine to heroin. Not only was heroin faster money, but those arrested for heroin sales typically received less jail time. The New York Mafia and their affiliates had long been the premier heroin traffickers in New York City and supplied many Black and Hispanic drug organizations with heroin. For decades, the Mafia brought heroin into New York through the French Connection smuggling route, which transported heroin refined in France over to Montreal, Canada, then into New York, up until it was broken up in the early 70s. Then in 1975, an alternative to the French Connection emerged, known as the Pizza Connection, which was a system where Sicilians smuggled heroin into the US through pizza parlor fronts and brought in upwards of $200 million worth of heroin a year. Around the time that George was beginning his start in the heroin business, the mafia took a major hit when the Pizza Connection was dismantled by authorities. Over 24 Sicilian and Italian mobsters went on trial in 1985, and many would be convicted. This opened the door for other heroin dealers in New York to fill the void, and it was around this time that the leaders of Chinese social associations known as Tongs became one of the top suppliers of heroin in New York. Tongs trafficked large amounts of dope through their middlemen, such as the Flying Dragons gang from Chinatown. George happened to be intrigued by mafia figures and revered some of the family bosses in New York, such as Carmine Persico of the Colombo family and Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, who was also heavily involved in heroin dealing. George began working for Victor and George Torres, two brothers in their 20s who dominated the South Bronx heroin market and had inherited their drug operation from their own father, Victor Torres Sr. The Torres brothers sold several heroin brands, but their most popular was named Checkmate, which had a logo of a king being checkmated by two castles. The brothers were multimillionaires by their early 20s and had opened up a $30 million shopping mall and bowling alley in Levittown, Puerto Rico. George first started as a lookout for the Torres brothers on Watson Avenue in the Soundview neighborhood and was quickly promoted to a pitcher, or someone who makes hand-to-hand drug transactions. The brothers used various apartments throughout the Bronx known as cutting mills, where workers diluted pure heroin, cut it up, and packed it in smooth, glossy, air and water-resistant small paper bags called glassines. George soon became a manager and oversaw the sale of a heroin brand named Blue Thunder. His drug spot operated right here at East 166th Street and Washington Avenue in the Morrisania section of the South Bronx, a grim and dangerous area but a profitable drug location. George was up early to make sure that his spot was up and running for the day, a regimen which he learned from Joey White. The location was busy with drug traffic, and soon the teenage Rivera's drug sales were clearing $65,000 a week. After paying back the Torres brothers, he paid his employees from his 10% cut, and the rest was his. He hired numerous employees, some of which were old enough to be his grandfather. He employed family, childhood friends, and old alum from the Cabrini group home. His crew was comprised of blacks and Puerto Ricans, but he preferred to hire blacks as he felt that his own people were more likely to betray him. As is customary for most top-level drug dealers to excel in their profession, he never touched his product and barely drank alcohol. In August of 1986, George's mentor, Joey Navedo, was named in a major drug bust in New York City, but he was nowhere to be found and authorities were looking for him. Rivera's young age and boyish looks were contradictory to some of his vicious characteristics. He was known to have a bad temper, and while working for the Torres brothers, he was allegedly involved in several shootouts with rivals. Still only a teenager, the name Boy George was already ringing through the streets as being synonymous with a formidable reputation. By the fall of 1986, drug sales at 166 in Washington continued to increase. With George's newfound abundance of cash, he acted on his flamboyant tastes. At only 18 years old, he was driving around in numerous different luxury cars, which included a charcoal-colored Mercedes-Benz 190. He could never be seen without the freshest of threads and purchased expensive gold chains from his jeweler in Chinatown. George used a luxury cab company named the OJ Car Service to make deliveries. OJ's was one of the biggest car services in New York at the time, and DJs, rappers, and hustlers frequently used their services to show up at events. OJ's was so popular it was even referenced in numerous rap song lyrics. George paid drivers $100 an hour to remain on call, and it was at OJ's that he met an older Jamaican hustler in his late 30s named Ward Johnson. Drivers at OJ's weren't known by their real names, but rather the number they used while they drove. Johnson was known as 4-6, and he invited him on board to join his heroin operation. Rapper Fat Joe claims that he had an incident with Boy George on the streets of the Bronx. When Joe was a teenager getting his feet wet in the drug game, he said he regularly infiltrated on other dealers' territories. And when George noticed Joe on Cortlandt Avenue arguing with another kid over a money debt, George confronted him. Joe wasn't familiar with Boy George at the time, and after the two got into a heated exchange, George threatened to kill Joe and his family. When the kid who was in debt to Joe informed him who Boy George was, Joe instantly conceded the argument and apologized to George. In the spring of 1987, Rivera and 4-6 obtained 100 grams of bulk heroin and formed a cutting mill in an apartment in a building on East 213th Street in the Bronx. They recruited numerous associates to join their venture, including men named Raz, Lucci, and Angel, as well as their girlfriends. 4-6 was put in charge of the operation, and he became George's second in command and looked after around a dozen people who worked in the mill, cutting up and bagging heroin. In June of 1987, the DEA took down the Torres brothers. They were arrested in Puerto Rico, and authorities swept 21 apartments throughout New York City and arrested 36 of their workers. The brothers were charged with running a $200 million a year heroin franchise. The misfortune of the Torres brothers was now Boy George's big opportunity. George immediately put his employees to work to get product ready. The Blue Thunder brand was instantly shelved and was replaced with the new product, which would become Boy George's signature brand, Obsession. The logo of a king's crown was stamped on glassines in red ink, and by the next morning, East 166th Street and Washington Avenue was open for business once again, with Obsession now being the store's trademark product. George was now the boss, and he assigned 4-6 to handle the administrative duties of the new operation. 4-6 set up a phony business named Tuxedo Enterprises, which acted as a car leasing company. They used livery cabs to make deliveries, and 4-6 used phony guarantors to lease cars, and used friends in real estate to rent apartments under fake names to use as drug mills. George often spoke in code over the phone and would speak to his partners in Pig Latin and referred to bricks as girls, and they used various beeper codes to page each other with. That summer, George and his crew distributed about $100,000 worth of heroin per week. George purchased heroin from those connected to Chinese tongs, and some of his suppliers were members of the Flying Dragons gang. He secretly referred to his Chinese connections as fried rice, and he would purchase upwards of 700 grams of high-purity heroin from them, then pass along to 4-6 to organize its processing. The Obsession product was hailed for its potency, and it became a favorite for users. Boy George's squad of hustlers was known as the Obsession Crew. The crew included numerous local street hoods like Will Love, a friend of George's from Morris High School nicknamed Ice, and Bob Lemon from the Wagner houses in East Harlem. With the operation's rise in stature came a rise in danger, so George delegated people to import guns through a store in Virginia, and the Obsession crew built up a stockpile of shotguns, Uzis, and .357 Magnums. Each cutting mill was secured by armed guards, and one mill would last a week up until several months before they switched locations to avoid detection by bringing too much attention to it. Raz and Lucci were responsible for delivering the bricks to the managers of the heroin sales locations, which were known as stores. They brought bricks packed in bags or suitcases to the managers of each store. One story alleges that in 1987, Boy George murdered an acquaintance of his. The acquaintance had disrespected George to a friend, and unbeknownst to him, that friend was the brother of a woman that George had been dating. One evening, George and this man shared a shrimp scampi dinner together. Then after the dinner, George allegedly shot and killed him and threw his body over a bridge. Afterwards, it became a running joke amongst George and his crew, where they referred to murdering people as eating shrimp. In the summer of 1987, George is also alleged to have organized an ambush to eliminate all of his nearby competitors, but instead, only an innocent bystander was killed. Around that same time in 1987, a random murder occurred in the Bronx, which authorities would later allege to be at the hands of Boy George. George was sitting in his parked Mercedes-Benz off the FDR Drive, waiting for an upcoming meeting, when a drunk driver bumped into his car and didn't stop. George then chased after him and forced him off the road, then approached the driver's side and stabbed the man several times, leaving him for dead in the front seat. By the end of 1987, Boy George was running 5 heroin stores in the South Bronx and Harlem. His 5 stores were located at East 166th Street and Washington Avenue, his first spot in the Morrisania section of the South Bronx, Avenue St. John and Southern Boulevard in the Longwood section of the South Bronx, a playground in the Melrose Projects on Cortlandt Avenue and East 156th Street in the Melrose section of the South Bronx, on East 122nd Street and 2nd Avenue near the Wagner Projects in the East Harlem section of Manhattan, and in an abandoned building at East 139th Street and Brook Avenue in the Mott Haven section of the South Bronx. Boy George ran his operation with discipline and structure. Each store had a spot owner, and each owner employed a variety of street managers, sellers, steerers, and lookouts, as well as other assistants. 4-6 kept detailed written ledgers for the operation. The spot owners kept the percentage of the proceeds of the heroin sales, paid their employees from their end, and the rest went to Rivera. They closed their spots while children were walking to and from the nearby schools. George docked pay for those who were late and also offered incentives to his top performers. Top dealers received gold belt buckles with their names inscribed in diamonds and also received trips to Puerto Rico and Disneyland. George was able to establish a delicate balance of fear, admiration, and respect from his associates and underlings. He was hailed by many for his generosity, but never did they forget what he was capable of, and never mistook his nice gestures for weakness. Several of George's stores were generating tens of thousands of dollars a day, but the St. John location was his most lucrative. It was conveniently situated right off the Bruckner Expressway, and commuters could pull in, get their fix, and jump right back on the highway. With the increase in profit also came an increase in George's appetite for the finer things. His fleet of luxury cars had grown to more than a dozen. He was making frequent trips to Hawaii and Puerto Rico and still visited the Great Adventure amusement park, seemingly to satisfy those boyish urges which still remained. His favorite comedian was Andrew Dice Clay, whose offensive jokes with an immature undertone resonated with his own youthful yet brash style. He once sent a girlfriend on a day trip to San Francisco just to buy him a pair of Nikes that were sold out in New York. He was generous with his money and paid for his crew to have a good time wherever they went. George had kept in touch with Joey Navedo, who was still hustling on the streets, but unbeknownst to George, Joey was moonlighting as a confidential informant. He had been feeding the feds information about the obsession operation, and in the late summer of 1987, Joey had introduced George to an undercover detective who bought 2 ounces of 88% pure heroin. Authorities were looking for Rivera in an unrelated investigation when they were tipped off to his cutting mill at East 213th Street. They entered the apartment to find incriminating items such as drug paraphernalia, a bulletproof vest, a shotgun, and loads of ammunition. But luckily for George, the apartment had recently been abandoned due to a burglary scare, and he had relocated the mill to a room in a Marriott Marquis hotel in Manhattan. After learning of the seizure, George decided to rebrand his product to stay one step ahead of authorities and started selling his heroin under the name Delirious. The logo of Delirious was a crazed-looking man with a bulbous nose, and in addition to the name, it scared away users and sales plummeted. Soon afterwards, production of Delirious was shut down, and he returned to his breadwinner, Obsession, which customers had developed a loyalty to. In October of '87, Joey and the undercover agent again met with Rivera and several of his associates for a purchase of $5,000 worth of leftover Delirious heroin. This would be the last transaction with the man, as Force 6 shared his accurate suspicions with George that he may be an undercover. Soon after that meeting, George relocated his cutting mill from the Marriott Marquis hotel room to various different homes in the Bronx, some of which were his employees' apartments. In January of 1988, George began dating a girl who would soon become part of his heroin business. One day, he visited her and her mother at their apartment on East Tremont Avenue and noticed that there was no food in the fridge, the cabinets were empty and full of roaches, and that they had a disheveled pet dog. So he sent some of his workers to go to the grocery store, and soon thereafter, several Jeeps pulled up in front of the building with trunks stacked with grocery bags. They filled their refrigerator, freezer, and cabinets to the brim with food, and there were still so many grocery bags left over that they had to be stored under their beds, and George even purchased a flea collar for their dog. George despised disorder and was strictly regimented in all areas of his life, and in addition to avoiding drugs and alcohol, he was also a fitness nut. He ate healthy meals and shunned junk food, took vitamins, jogged, and cycled. George hired his girlfriend to work in the mill processing dope, and while she was only one of numerous women he was seeing, she wore a gold nameplate necklace which said "Boy George," as if to show that she belonged to him. His employees worked long shifts in the mills, sometimes sniffing cocaine to help keep them awake, and this labor-intensive routine resulted in the production of 100 to 200 grams of heroin a day, 5 days a week. By early 1988, his business was a well-oiled machine. At only 20 years old, Boy George Rivera was making millions, and he had the most prominent heroin operation in all of the South Bronx.